Welcome to Henry George Daily Devotional, episode 38. Yep. Book 3, The Laws of Distribution, chapter 2, Rent and the Law of Rent. Okay, I thought we hadn't really discussed law of rent much, but we've definitely mentioned it there earlier, and then when we were talking about yeah. All right, here we go. I'm terribly excited. The term rent, in its economic sense, that is, when used as I am using it, to distinguish that part of the produce which accrues to the owners of land or other natural capabilities by virtue of their ownership, differs in meaning from the word rent as commonly used. In some respects, this economic meaning is narrower than the common meaning. In other respects, it is wider. It is narrower in this. In common speech, we apply the word rent to payments for the use of buildings, machinery, fixtures, etc., as well as to payments for the use of land or other natural capabilities. And in speaking of the rent of a house or the rent of a farm, we do not separate the price for the use of the improvements from the price for the use of the bare land. But in the economic meaning of rent, payments for the use of any of the products of human exertion are excluded, and of the lumped payments for the use of houses, farms, etc., only that part which constitutes the consideration for the use of the land, that part paid for the use of buildings or other improvements, being properly interest, as it is a consideration for the use of capital. All right, yes. So this kind of use of the term rent, people will call it land rent or economic rent. And then when you pay somebody to use their, uh, you know, plow or their, I don't know, their cool grill, that would be paying them for the use of their capital, and that the return to them for the use of their capital is interest. So yeah. Next time you go rent a car, you should argue with them and say, no, 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 I'm interesting a car. Okay, back to George. It is wider. The definition of rent, it is wider in this. In common speech, we speak of rent only when owner and user are distinct persons. But in the economic sense, there's also rent where the same person is both owner and user. Where owner and user are thus the same person, whatever part of his income he might obtain by letting, yes, the term letting. That's the general term of somebody who has rights or possession of a thing, letting somebody else use it for a fee. So we should go, yeah, the British they let a flat. Yes, we should go back to that. You next time you're trying to rent an apartment, you should be like, "Hey, no, no, no. I want to rent the land and I want to let the apartment." And demand a breakdown. um yes. Where owner uses the same, whatever part of his income might have been by letting the land to another is rent, while the return for his labor and capital are that part of his income which they would yield him did he hire instead of owning the land. Rent is also expressed in a selling price. When land is purchased, the payment, which is made for the ownership or right to perpetual use, is rent commuted or capitalized. If I buy land for a small price and hold it until I can sell it for a large price, I have become rich, not by wages for my labor, excuse me, or by interest upon my capital, but by the increase of rent. Rent, in short, is the share in the wealth produced, which the exclusive right to the use of natural capabilities gives to the owner. Wherever land has an exchange value, there is rent in the economic meaning of the term. Wherever land having a value is used, either by owner or hirer, there is rent actual. Wherever it is not used but still has a value, there is rent potential. It is this capacity of yielding rent which gives value to land. Until its ownership, well, it seems a little backwards. It's the value of the land that gives it the capacity to yield rent. People only want to use the land because it helps them do things they want to do in life, either produce capital or wealth, produce wealth, which they can convert to capital if they want to, or gratify their own desires, which I guess that's what wealth is. Anyway, until its ownership will confer some advantage, land has no value. Yes, it will confer some advantage. Yeah, I don't know, whatever. In speaking of the value of land, I use and shall use the words as referring to the value of the bare land. When I wish to speak of the value of land and improvements, I shall use those words. Thank you, George. Thus, rent or land value does not arise from the productiveness or utility of land. Thus, rent or land value does not arise from the productiveness or utility of land. It in no wise represents any help or advantage given to production, but simply the power of securing part of the results of production. No matter what are its capabilities, land can yield no rent and have no value until someone is willing to give labor or the results of labor for the privilege of using it. I don't know if this is such an important point. Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel like a piece of land in its pure like theoretical capabilities when you look at it has value, and that value is due to its capacity for, you know, productiveness or utility. And George wants to say it doesn't have that value. Um, well, he's saying until someone is willing. Yeah, yeah, that's the same thing as like, yeah, okay. Until someone is willing to give labor or the results of labor for the privilege of using it. Yeah. If no one's willing to pay for a piece of land, it doesn't have any value. Oh, I grant that, but it's not. Yeah, yeah. Just a pedantic point. And what anyone will thus give depends not upon the capacity of the land, but upon its capacity as compared with that of land that can be had for nothing. Yes, that is also fair. Yes, this is a big point he's going to stress too. And this is going to run into the whole like marginal land idea, which is important. I may have very rich land, but it will yield no rent and have no value so long as there is other land as good to be had without cost. And when this other land is and I often catch myself in this mental mistake of like, imagine, an acre plot that's like wonderfully rich and that is like super far away, and an acre plot that is much closer. And you think of like, well, that far away land is better. It's just not closer. Well, proximity proximity makes it is just in the calculus of the value of land. I forget that so much. But when this other land is appropriated and the best land to be had for nothing is inferior, either in fertility, situation, or other quality, my land will begin to have a value and yield rent. And though the productiveness of my land may decrease, yet if the productiveness of the land to be had without charge decreases in greater proportion, the rent I can get and consequently the value of my land will steadily increase. Rent, in short, is the price of monopoly, arising from the reduction to individual ownership of natural elements which human exertion can neither produce nor increase. You might take issue with that increase bit where it's like, oh yeah, if you treat the land in these ways, the soil in these certain ways, or then the land is more valuable. Those sorts of things would be considered improvements, just like, building a water park on a piece of land is an improvement, which makes that land, um, you know, the land itself stays constant while improvements upon it make it a more, I don't know, valuable investment or something. And I got into an argument recently about like, oh, if you like take a bunch of sand and you fill in some watery area to build more land, the argument that Georgist would make is that you have harvested sand from the earth, um, just like taking out oil or something, which you would owe some kind of a tax back to the owners of the earth, which are everybody. And then you have used that to build an improvement in some other area. You have not really, so to speak, created land. Um, it does still confuse me. Um, because say everyone got their memories wiped, and then somebody came along and saw that, coastal space, and they're like, oh, look at this fine land here, and then they find a book, and the book's like, oh, 100 years ago we just moved all the sand here, so this is not considered land, and this is not land, this is an improvement. Um, hmm, not sure. If one man owned all the land accessible to any community, he could of course demand any price or condition for its use that he saw fit, and as long as his ownership was acknowledged, and the other members of the community would have but death or emigration as the alternative to submission to his terms. Um, Rent and the Law of Rent. That was the name. I couldn't remember the name of this chapter. Okay, we're not finishing it today. Yes, this is a very helpful thought experiment, this one. If one man owned all the land accessible to any community, he could of course demand any price or condition for its use that he saw fit, and as long as his ownership was acknowledged, the other members of the community would have but death or emigration as the alternative to submission to his terms. Yes, as long as his ownership was acknowledged. See, I would prefer you read this sentence and you get rid of this. As long as his ownership was acknowledged, you would just say the other members of the community would have but death, emigration, or revolution or rebellion as the alternative to submission to his terms. This has been the case in many communities, but in the form of modern society, the land, though generally reduced to individual ownership, is in the hands of too many different persons to permit the price which can be obtained for its use to be fixed by mere capital or desire. While each individual owner tries to get all he can, there is a limit to what he can get, which constitutes the market price or market rent of the land, and which varies with different lands and at different times. The law or relation, that's funny to think about, like, if we just kept doing things as they are, I'm sure there would be like a revolution sooner rather than later. But like, would just, some billionaire, one of these like hedge fund managers, would just like BlackRock or whomever, I get BlackRock and Blackstone mixed up, just eventually own like all of California and then eventually own all of America. I don't know. Um, Anyway, where was I? While each individual tries to get all he can, there's a limit to what he can get, which constitutes the market price or market rent of the land, which varies with different lands and at different times. The law or relation which, under these circumstances of free competition among all parties, the condition which in tracing out the principles of political economy is always to be assumed, determines what rent or price can be got by the owner, is styled the law of rent. This fixed with certainty, we have more than a starting point from which the laws which regulate wages and interest may be traced. 4. As the distribution of wealth is a division, in ascertaining what fixes the share of the produce which goes as rent, we also ascertain what fixes the share which is left for wages. Where there is no cooperation of capital, what share is left for wages where there is no cooperation of capital? Yes, in the easy instance where it's just land and labor, once you know how much is for the land, you know the rest would go to labor because you don't have to worry about capital yet. And what fixes the joint share left for wages and interest where capital does cooperate in production? Yes, when you have both or all three, troth. That's a joke I made on my Substack a while ago. Why don't we have a term for both that means three things? And I proposed troth, even though troth is some old English word, nobody uses it. So here, troth, in troth, capital, land, and labor. Yes, I don't even remember what I was trying to use troth for. Whatever. Yes. Yes, I guess where troth, capital, land, and labor are all working together, once you know the return to land, then you know that wages and interest have to account for the rest of the return to production. Fortunately, as to the law of rent, there is no necessity for discussion. Authority here coincides with common sense. For once, George agrees with the current economist. I do not mean to say that the accepted law of rent has never been disputed. In all the nonsense that in the present disjointed condition of the science has been printed as political economy, it would be hard to find anything that has not been disputed. But I mean to say that it has the sanction of all economic writers who are really to be regarded as authority. As John Stuart Mill says, Book 2, Chapter 16, there are few persons who have refused their assent to it except from not having thoroughly understood it. The loose and inaccurate way in which it is often apprehended by those who affect to refute it is very remarkable. George says, an observation which has received many later exemplifications. I just want to get through this, and that will conclude today's episode. And the accepted dictum of the current political economy has the self-evident character of a geometric axiom. This accepted law of rent, which John Stuart Mill denominates the pons asinorum of political economy, is sometimes styled Ricardo's law of rent, from the fact that, although not the first to announce it, he first brought it prominently into notice. Crossed. According to McCulloch, the law of rent was first stated in a pamphlet by Dr. James Anderson of Edinburgh in 1777, and simultaneously in the beginning of the century by Sir Edward West, Mr. Malthus, and Mr. Ricardo. That would be simultaneously the beginning of the century would be the early 1800s. It is, and here it is. I'm going to get this tattooed. Should we all do it together? Let's get this all tattooed onto our... If we need three laws, the human body is mostly has paired features. Do I have three of anything? 10 fingers, 2, 2, 1, 1, eye, mouth, teeth. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you can think of any feature of your body that you have three of. No more, no less. Anyway, and then we'll get whatever body features it has. We'll tattoo this on one. It has to be an exterior body feature. And then we tattoo the law of wages and the law of interest on the other two. Are you in? The rent of land is determined by the excess of its produce over that which the same application can secure from the least productive land in use. I'll read it again. The rent of land is determined by the excess of its produce over that which the same application can secure from the least productive land in use. This law, which of course applies to land use for other purposes than agriculture and to all natural agencies such as mines, fisheries, etc., has been exhaustively explained and illustrated by all the leading economists since Ricardo, but its mere statement has all the force of a self-evident proposition, for it is clear that the effect of competition is to make the lowest reward for which labor and capital will engage in production the highest that they can claim, and hence to enable the owner of more productive land to appropriate in rent all the return above that required to recompense labor and capital at the ordinary rate. That is to say, what they can obtain upon the least productive land in use, or at the least productive point, where of course no rent is paid. Yeah, yeah. You get you get paid you get paid as much to go work somebody's farm as you know, just enough to persuade you to work that guy's farm, just enough to persuade you to do that instead of working the worst land, probably farther out, or just not as good, even if it's as nearby, not as rich of a land. If you were to work that land that nobody is using, and you wouldn't really have to pay for because no one's using it, um, however much you would make on that land, you'll get paid, you know, epsilon more, or maybe not even more. Um, I guess not even more to work somebody else's land. And then if that land that you're working that somebody else has, if it's super duper rich, you know, he's only going to pay you to do, yeah, that difference in that richness between and the goodness of that land versus the nearby land is what is the return to that land. Anyway, George is going to tell us all about this over and over and over. So I'll see you later, and we'll get back to George. Bye bye.